Oh, hi. How are you doing? I was just playing with my Nintendo Switch, which I bought last Christmas for the kids. But anyway, our goal today is to talk about product design, and I like talking about product design because it allows me to talk about video game systems, which is one of my favorite examples of product design, right? And hopefully, you've realized the reason why we're discussing this is because the big group project for the class is going to require you to design a project, right? And so, what you're going to have to do inside your learning communities is come up with an innovative idea for a product and defend it over the course of a document. Right, and so I think it's important before we sort of launch into that to look at some of the big thinkers and theorists in the field and talk about what they have to bring to the table as far as their ideas. Right, and so what we're going to look at is we're going to look at two giants in the field of product design. One of them is Tim Brown, and one of them is Don Norman. And you've read two pieces by each of these figures. Um, it's hard to underestimate the influence of these two people. They've had a huge impact on not just Silicon Valley, but the entire world of engineering, right? And so I think it's important that you know at least a little bit about who these people are, right? So I'm going to start by looking at some things about their biographies because I think knowing some things about who the people are helps us understand where they're coming from with their ideas, right? And then we're finished with that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the design process and how it's conceptualized by these figures, right? And then we're going to look at a couple specific ideas. We're going to look at emotional design and systems thinking, which I think is a big impact of contemporary design thinking. And then we're going to stop with some final questions, some things to get you to think and reflect and prepare you for what we're going to talk about next module, right? So, anyways, let's go and talk about the two figures. So, Tim Brown is the former CEO of a company called IDEO, right? IDEO has had a huge impact, particularly in Silicon Valley. And that's partially because it's been involved in a lot of education efforts, right? So it's done a lot to sort of push the basic ideas of design thinking out into the public, right? But he's also a capable designer in his own right, and and his firm has worked with a number of really important products, right? So he worked in the original Apple Mouse, right? Was one product he worked on. Palm 5 PDA, right? Was another product that he worked on, which is a lot of ways a predecessor of today's smartphones. He even worked on the stand-up toothpaste tube for Procter and Gamble, right? And in addition to a million of other companies in a million of other areas, right? So he's a big figure for a number of reasons. Now, Don Norman's kind of an interesting guy. He was a former engineer, and then he decided to head back to school and get a graduate degree in psychology, right? And then he ended up applying some of the psychological things he was learning, right, during the burgeoning moment of cognitive science, applying that to the engineering product design space, and that's where he got a lot of his fame. His One of the things he's most known for is a book called The Design of Everyday Things, which my 2E students know something about because I always have students in that class read that particular book. If they remember correctly, he talks a lot about his frustration with doors. I think Don Norman's kind of like overly obsessed with doors and teapots, which he talks about in that book too. And in addition to being a theorist, I mean, he's worked for IDEO himself for a little while, and also done major things like investigated the Three Mile Island nuclear accident. He worked in user experience design with Apple, and so he's a well known designer in his own right as well, right? And what underpins these contemporary theorists is this idea of the design process. And there's a lot of different ways of representing this, right? IDEO represents it as this sort of cyclical process. And I really like this diagram here because it really gets at the basic idea, right? And they talk about like three stages, although talking about them as stages is kind of complicated because you're always circling back and returning to the different stages as you move through the process, right? But basically, the idea is the design process starts with ideation, right, where you research what your user wants, gets ideas from them, so on and so forth, and then it moves from there to inspiration, where you prototype, test, and so on and so forth. And then the final stage is implementation, where you market, manufacture, so on and so forth. And at any stage of this process, you can return to an earlier stage, right? Another popular model comes from the Stanford Design School, which the process here is very similar, but they start with empathize, they move on to defining the problem, Then they talk about ideation and then prototyping and then testing in a very similar way. All these are kind of circular, and you can return to earlier stages and later stages and so on and so forth. But I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm going to let the master, Don Norman, explain this for you. So this is only going to take like 3 minutes. He's going to go ahead and explain some things, and then we're going to come back.
I practice human-centered design. But what does that mean? It actually can mean a variety of things. We teach a method. We say, first of all, let's go out and watch people, observe, do field work to see what they really do in their lives, whether it's education or entertainment or their jobs. Find out what happens, because don't ask them. People often don't realize what they need because people are used to what they're doing. And if you ask them what their problems are, well, they'll tell you something about what they're trying to accomplish today and what's in the way. Whereas if we watch and observe, we might think of an entirely different solution to their problems. So we start off by observing, and then we actually try to figure out what is the real problem they're facing and what are the possible solutions. And we think of a variety of solutions, and then we try to see which one might be most appropriate, and we test. We do quick, rapid prototypes. We believe in our prototype. I can build something in a half hour that I can test with you. You know, a lot of engineers say, oh, gee, it's going to take me 6 months to build this. How can we test it till we have it built? No, you fake it. We use methods from theater to make it make-believe. You know, we take something out of our pocket. We take a piece of paper and say, make-believe, this is your new display. How would you use it? We make things out of chalk. We make things out of cardboard. We make things out of foam core. We can cut things and to make them to the right shapes. So we can see how people would use them and experiment with them. You can even mock up an automobile with just a bunch of chairs in the right ordering. And then, as we learn what people need and what we're going to build, we make better and better and better models, and pretty soon a pretty final product. But we're always testing, always iterating, changing what we're doing because we're learning. And even though I've had pretty near 50 years of experience watching, observing, and understanding people, and a PhD in psychology, I'm always wrong. I'm always surprised because people are so variable, do things that are so unexpected. You've always got to go out and watch and test. Now, that's the essence of human-centered design, but you know something? It usually doesn't work in a company. The reason it doesn't work is because, well, Norman's Law. The day the product team is put together, it's over its budget and behind schedule. So that means that all of these wonderful early explorations and tests and iterations, the person in charge of the product is apt to say, yeah, what you want to do is the correct way of doing it, but we don't have time. So we'll have to skip it, or maybe short-circuit it. Instead of spending a week, we'll give you a few hours. But next time we'll do it better. There is never a next time because the same story happens next time. So we have to change our ways. We have to adapt what we're doing. This means we should always be studying people, even when there's no product in mind, on the side, so that when the product team is assembled, we're ready. We can say, oh yeah, we've been studying that. It also means that we sometimes short-circuit. We say, okay, let's quickly do something, do a few cycles in a day so we can learn something. Because it's really important that we keep up with the product cycle.
Anyways, hopefully one of the things that you're seeing here, right, is they go through and talk about this ideation or this design process, right, is it should remind you of another process that you've been taught quite often, right, which is the writing process, right? And I think one of the reasons why writing teachers gel so much with design thinking is because it's very similar to the way we imagine writing and how it works, right? Where you start off in the planning stages, right? And then you move on to actually writing and drafting, right? And then you revise, and then once you're satisfied with the product, it moves towards publication. And then sometimes writers even return to text after they've been published and revise them subsequently and things like that, right? So there's lots of common features between these two. And I really think, to be honest with you, when we're talking about the writing process or we're talking about the product design process, we're really pretty much talking about the exact same thing, right? Now I want to move to talk about a couple like specific ideas that they refer to. And one of them I want to talk about is Don Norman talks about emotional design, right? And this is an attempt to correct some of the criticisms that were leveled at him for in his original book, Design Thinking, or the Design of Everyday Things. I'm sorry, where he presents a very sort of utilitarian view of design, where he talks a lot about functionality and things like that. And so in this book, he kind of wants to take a step back and talk about aesthetics and emotion and how those are all related to products, right? And he talks about three different components of emotional design, right? One of them is what he calls visceral design, which he sees as concerned mostly with appearances. One is behavioral design, which he considers related to pleasure and effectiveness of use. And the other is reflective design, which he sees as sort of rational and intellectual and so forth. And one example of a product that I think fits this picture really well is this thing I bought from a company called Atato, which is apparently an Israeli design firm. And I saw this advertised, and I just fell in love with it, and I had to buy it. This is a Nessie tea infuser. We're going along with the tea thing, like in Don Norman, right? And if I open this up, you can see, it's just a silicone, like squishy silicone product. And in fact, in some ways, the fact that it is a metal, like most tea infusers, makes it a little less functional, right? And basically, you put your tea leaves in here, right, and then you snap it back together, and then you dump this in your teapot, and then it like kind of sticks out. It has a little neck sticking out like Nessie, right? This is the cutest damn thing. I mean, I just love this thing, right? And here's the point I want to make about this, right? So you look at this and you think, oh, this is stupid, right? This is just like a normal tea infuser. The aesthetics really don't add anything to it, right? And part of the point that Don Norman's making is that it actually does. It actually makes a big difference, right? Because I'm attached to this, because it has an emotional resonance for me as a product, right? That makes me more willing to use it. And indeed, since I purchased this, which is just recently, I've been using this constantly to make tea for myself, right? And I very rarely have tea on a regular basis, and I've definitely been drinking a lot of green tea lately, right? And so that's one of the points he made. One of the points he's trying to make is that visceral design, so aesthetic design, right, has an impact on behavioral design, right? That the more beautiful an object is, the more likely we're more willing we are to spend time with it, to use it, and to make it a part of our everyday experiences, right? And so that, I think that's the main argument he's making in this chapter, right? And so if these three terms are useful for you when you're writing your product design analyses, by all means use them. It may help you sort of dive into the product a little more deeply, right? Another concept that comes up that I think might be useful when you're doing your product analyses is systems thinking, right? And this is a little bit complicated, but I want to take a second to talk about it. So Don Norman, when he's discussing it, he says something along these lines. He says, in reality, a product is all about the experience. It is about discovery, purchase, anticipation, opening the package, the very first usage. It is also continued usage, learning, the need for assistance, updating, maintenance, supplies, and eventual renewal in the form of disposal or exchange, right? And systems thinking, basically, what it means is, rather than just looking at the isolated product or the isolated individual, what systems thinking encourages us to do is to see its relationship to the multiple systems that we find ourselves in the world around us, right? And so we're talking about cultural systems, economic systems, a multitude of different things, right? And so that's the goal of systems thinking, is to see us as part of this larger whole, right? And I found this diagram that sort of illustrates a lot of the components of systems thinking, right? So rather than seeing things disconnected, systems thinkers view things as interconnected. Rather than seeing things as linear, as part of a linear process, they see things as circular, right? Rather than seeing things as they tend to look at relationships between things. They look at relationships between parts and wholes and that sort of stuff, right? And so the goal is to see us as part of these big interlocking systems. And one thing I think that does this really well is the Nintendo Switch, right? The designers of the Nintendo Switch did a great job of thinking through all the different ways that we might integrate this into our lives, right? So, for example, it's got a kickstand integrated into it, so you can place it on a table, right, and play it with groups of friends, right? Not only can you play it solo pretty easily and play it like a classical game system, but it also has detachable controllers, right? So you can use these as Wiimotes, like with previous systems, right? But you can also use these to play two-player games and play with each other as well, right? And so the cool thing about the Switch is that it's designed to become an integral part of our life, right? And that's why it's a successful product, is that it's not just for one particular use, it's for multiple uses. And really, it works as an experience and not just as an isolated product, right? And so I think this is a really good example of systems thinking in action, right? Now, some final notes. There are, of course, some critics of systems thinking or design thinking, and we're going to see those critics on Friday, right? They're going to talk a little more about some of their problems at this point of view, right? But a couple things that you want to think about, right? One is that design thinking, right, very much is looking for, as we were saying before, it's looking at part and wholes and relationships and interconnectedness, right? But it's not as good at dealing with like disconnection, right? For moments where there's fissures and cracks in society as a whole, right? And so one question that we should ask ourselves as we're looking at products, right, is how does this model of design thinking fit into cultural conflict? When there's conflicts between groups of people over things like climate change or the economy or whatever, how does design thinking take into account that kind of stuff, right? And the second thing, and hopefully you've seen this by how Don Norman and Tim Brown dress, right? Is that design thinking very much puts the designer or the engineer at the sort of top of the pyramid, right? It's the designer who comes up with all these sort of creative, innovative solutions for products, right? Yes, they do listen to people, but their goal is to use that data and do creative, magical things with it, right? And so there's a question of whether that's a good idea, whether placing the designer in such a privileged role is the way we want to imagine the process, right? So hopefully this gets you thinking a little bit more about design and gives you some things to consider when you're analyzing products for your next writing assignment.